Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I'd like to talk today about the glycemic index and what it really means. The glycemic index is a measure of the rate that blood sugar rises following consumption of a carbohydrate food. Generally, the higher the rise and the faster the rise in blood sugar, the higher the glycemic index of the carbohydrate food. The glycemic index is often quoted by nutritionists, and there is actually tables of foods showing their glycemic index, and they are measured in relation sometimes to white bread and sometimes to glucose. And the fact that white bread and glucose have very similar glycemic indexes shows you the detrimental effects of consuming white bread. It's very similar to consuming liquid glucose, but that is another story. Let's get back to the glycemic index. So you measure the rate of the rise in blood sugar compared to a standard food, which is white bread or glucose. Now, this is very useful. Researchers use the glycemic index to be able to measure particular biological parameters after certain foods are eaten, and they can then ascertain whether this is having an effect on physiology. But does the glycemic index have important implications for normal people in the real world? Can you make informed decisions on a food based on the glycemic index? You can, but you have to be very careful, because there are many foods on the glycemic index that are actually very low. For example, fructose is a food that's on the glycemic index. It has a very low glycemic index. Table sugar, sucrose, also has a low glycemic index, and that's partly because it contains a molecule of fructose. These foods would appear to be good choices because they are so low on the glycemic index. In fact, many fruits actually get their low glycemic index because they contain either sucrose or fructose. However, fructose in excess is a metabolic poison, and remember, fructose is present in the sucrose molecule, so sucrose, which is table sugar, is also a metabolic poison. And in high amounts, if you consume a lot of soft drinks, for example, a lot of fruit juices, you will damage your metabolism. So you have to be careful when looking at the glycemic index. There are certain differences between grains of rice, for example. Some refined rice has a lower glycemic index than some of the brown whole grain rice. And again, that is disingenuous, because no one would advocate consuming refined rice over whole grain rice, because the whole grain rice contains things and factors, nutrients, micronutrients that are required for health, whereas those have been removed from the white rice. Now, the glycemic index does have a use. Obviously, part of being healthy is maintaining normal blood sugar levels, and that means eating foods that don't cause a high glycemic effect in the body. In fact, the high glycemic response to foods is increasingly being seen as a cause of Western disease. However, you have to be very careful when simply looking and taking the glycemic index in isolation. Another factor that's often not considered about the glycemic index is the quantity of the food eaten, and this is why the glycemic load is a little bit of a better measure than the glycemic index, because it takes into account the actual amount of the food eaten. For example, if you eat something on the glycemic index that has a very high glycemic index, but you only eat a very small amount of it, then the glycemic load is very small. If you eat something with a very low glycemic index, but you eat a lot of it, the glycemic load is high. So the glycemic load is a better measure of the effects on health. And also you can measure the insulin response. The insulin index may even be better than the glycemic load. So the glycemic index is really a research tool, and those people who use the glycemic index to recommend foods should always give caveats. They should always explain why certain foods are low on the glycemic index and why certain foods are high. The trick to selecting foods is not to look at the glycemic index. The trick to selecting carbohydrate foods is to look at whether they are refined or unrefined. Some foods that have incredibly high glycemic indexes, some vegetables, there is no evidence that they cause any health problems whatsoever. But fructose, like I say, very low glycemic index, is now increasingly being linked to obesity. It's being linked to cardiovascular disease because it causes these metabolic dysfunctions. It causes a non-alcoholic fatty liver, and it causes insulin resistance. So I would suggest that if you've been selecting your foods based on their glycemic index, that you research the glycemic index a bit further. You can find articles on my website that look into the glycemic index, and if they have been used in a research setting, they've been used in a clinical trial, you should always take, when you extrapolate that to the real world, you should always take the results with a pinch of salt, because the real world is not a clinical setting. However, that doesn't mean that glycemic index is a useless tool. It's a very useful tool for those people who do research, but I would suggest that you base your food choices more on the degree of refining in those foods. Unrefined foods, whole plant foods, tend to be very healthy. Those that have been refined, including white crystalline fructose and white crystalline sucrose, tend to be disease causing, and even though they have a low glycemic index, I would avoid them completely.